One question that comes up a lot here is, what the hell is non-duality? How many people have no idea what non-duality is? Right? I mean, it comes from the Sanskrit term advaita, which literally means not to. And very simply, this is the simplest possible way of putting it. Other people here will probably put it much better than I can. It's really just a description of the awakened state of consciousness. And just in that awakened state, there's the realization that there isn't a duality between self, observer, and experience. It is all one. It is all one unfolding in which there appears to be a self, but we just realize in the end we are just that awareness that's always there. And one characteristic that comes up again and again and again in those teachings is the idea there's nowhere to get to. We're not on a path to some wonderful cosmic enlightened state. Yes, we're on a path, but really on a path to realizing there is no path, there's nowhere to get to. It's just waking up to the truth of our own being and the truth of what it is to be aware. And intrinsic to it is this whole idea of consciousness and what is consciousness, which is going to be a theme for a lot of this conference. In fact, I've got news for you. There is no such thing as consciousness, which will probably leave you all mystified. There is no such thing as consciousness. We often treat consciousness as something in the world. When we take a word and we add N-E-S-S to it, we talk about the state or quality of it. So, happiness is the state or quality of being happy. Happiness doesn't exist, the experience of being happy does. In that same way, consciousness as a thing, as a phenomena, doesn't really exist. But what is true is that each and every one of us is conscious. We are all experiencing beings. And that is the one thing we cannot doubt. We cannot doubt that we are aware. We could doubt everything about our experience. And right now we could be sitting in the Matrix. All of you know the Matrix, like the film, living in a virtual reality where this is all just a reality generated by a computer, and suddenly somebody will switch off the computer and we'll wake up and we're sitting at home. Even if this were the Matrix, we would still be aware. That being aware is always there, always present. So that's why I say there's no such thing as consciousness. When we think of consciousness as a thing, we actually get ourselves off on a bit of a wrong track. And I think this is what's happened a lot in some of the scientific approaches to consciousness. Scientists are sort of looking out there, trying to work out what is consciousness? Where does consciousness come from? How does it relate to the brain? What is this thing called consciousness? Forgetting that it is actually the very field in which they are doing their science. As I said in that little video, to be conscious is, the being conscious is where science takes place. All the ideas, the theories, the elaborations, it's all taking place in experience. And then we start looking for, well, what is consciousness? And I think that's where we begin to go wrong, rather than just recognizing the truth is that each and every one of us is aware. That's the truth. And everything we know is something that is known in our experience. And all that we know in a way is a representation of the world. And right now, we are sitting here, we are having this experience of being in a room with the sights, the sounds, the thoughts that are going through our minds, the feelings. What's happening is, light is coming into the eyes, being processed by the brain, the information is being processed, and very cleverly, the brain puts together its picture of what the world out there is like. And we think we're seeing the world directly. But what we're actually experiencing is the appearance, the representation that comes in the mind. And it's brilliant the way it does this, because it integrates sound with this, and touch, and smell. It's all integrated into this wonderful virtual reality. And so in some senses, we are sitting in the matrix. We're sitting in our own personal matrix that is being created second by second by second by second. So everything we know is ultimately our experience. That is our primary reality, the reality of our experience. What science is doing is taking our experience and looking out there and saying, well, what is the actual world like? The world we don't actually know physically. What is the actual world out there? What is it actually like? And so we do all these experiments and things, and we make hypotheses, but it's all based upon our experience. So in a way, there's two realities. There's the reality of our experience, and then there's what I call the reality out there, the physical reality that science is trying to understand. And what is fascinating is it turns out the two are completely different. Right now we think the world out there is as you see it, with the color, the sound, the sensations, the touch, the solidness. But the more that we look into what the actual physical world is like, it's nothing at all like our experience. I mean, just simple things like color. We see the color blue. There's no blue there. There's light of a certain frequency or energy, and we don't even know what that is. That's just a concept in the mind. But it's just a photon of a certain energy, say, which hits the eye. But the message that goes down the nerve fiber to the brain isn't a blue message. It doesn't go down a blue channel. It's exactly the same electrochemical signal if it was a red message, red photon. It's the brain that puts it all together. And then what appears in our experience is what philosophers call the qualia. That quality of blueness appears in our experience. And it's the same with everything. I mean, you're hearing my voice. In the physical world, there's just air molecules moving backwards and forwards very rapidly. They hit the air drum, and the air drum sends messages back to the brain, and the brain analyzes it and very cleverly works out the voice and creates the sound of my voice. But there's no sound out there. That's the old thing, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. The answer is no, but the air molecules are still moving, and maybe the ants hear the sound. But we can go even deeper and say, what is matter? I mean, this appears very solid stuff, very solid matter. But what modern science has discovered as we begin to analyze what is matter, it's almost like there's nothing actually there. We used to think matter was composed of little solid balls called atoms. That was the Greek idea. The ultimate constituent of matter was an atom, a little tiny solid particle. And that's because we experience particles, and so we imagine the world is made of particles. And then, with the advent of atomic physics, we realized that what we called those particles were actually more complex elementary particles with protons, neutrons, electrons going around them. And then as we got better and better understanding, we realized that most of that was actually empty space, 99.999999% empty space. If you made the center of an atom the size of a golf ball and put it in the middle of this room, the atom would be like electrons the size of peas spinning around the outside of the room, nearly all empty space. And then what we realize with quantum physics is that, neutrons, electrons, protons don't actually exist. There's no thing there. There's just the propensity to have a certain observation that these things, there's something goes on, there's an interaction, but there's no thing as we normally think of things there. There's just this field of information that we are experiencing. That's all there is, it seems now, physics saying there's just information. An electron, all we know of an electron is information about the way it interacts with other particles or other fields. One way it interacts we call charge, another way it interacts we call mass, another way it interacts we call spin. We don't know what these things are, they're just labels. All we have is the information that comes to us about what is out there. But then the miraculous thing that happens is that information, the information that's coming through photons, through light, the information that's coming through sound, and all the other information that we are receiving through the senses, that information, the whole field of information out there, sets up another pattern of information in the brain. This complex information field out there sets up another corresponding information pattern in the brain, complex information pattern. And that we experience. The experience of that information is this. This is how we experience information. This is how information appears in consciousness. This multi-sensory, multicolor, hi-fi, touchy-feely, three-dimensional, beautiful, smelly world that we live in. This is the information field appearing in our consciousness. And the big question of science in terms of this is, how on earth does that happen? How does the brain create consciousness? It's actually, I think, a wrong question. Because I think we are stuck at the moment in an old paradigm that doesn't really work. Where's my time? The paradigm is the model that any science goes by. Like quantum physics is a paradigm. It's like the big theory within which science does its work, or relativity is a paradigm, or DNA model in molecular biology. That's a paradigm. It's like the big system, the big idea within which things operate. Today, science operates in what I call a meta-paradigm. It's the paradigm behind all the other paradigms in physics. There's one fundamental worldview, one fundamental assumption, and that is that reality, the ultimate reality, is matter, energy, space, time. And once we understand matter, energy, space, time, we'll understand everything, including consciousness. That's the worldview that most of modern science operates in. But there's a huge problem with that paradigm. The test of any scientific theory, the test of any theory is, does it predict the world correctly? So when Einstein came along with the theory of relativity, it made certain predictions about how light would be bent around the sun, about how if you speeded up clocks, if you sent them very fast, they would tell time more slowly. They've done the experiments. Light is bent around the sun. When you send clocks around the world, they do run a little bit more slowly. So the prediction was true, and the theory holds. We have a worldview in science which does not predict the only thing we know for certain. We have a scientific worldview that does not predict that any of us should ever have a single conscious experience. According to the modern scientific worldview, we should all just be biological robots, doing our thing, eating, drinking, making love, singing songs, without any inner experience. Why is there inner experience? The fact that the current worldview doesn't predict it says there's something, not something wrong with it, there's something missing, there's something lacking in it. But with any paradigm shift, what tends to happen is we get stuck in the old worldview. And the classic case is the old geocentric view of the universe. The Earth was the center of the universe, so it was thought for thousands of years by most people, not everybody, but most people thought the Earth was the center of the universe. The problem was the planets, they didn't go round smoothly. They wandered. The word planeta means to wander. And they kept on trying to tweak the system, adding more circles in, doing this, keep tweaking it. Nobody dared question the fact that the Earth was the center of the universe until Copernicus came along. And even then, it took 150 years before his ideas were really accepted. We now take it for granted. But people were holding on to the old view and just finding ways to try and make it work. And I think that's what's happening with our current scientific worldview. We cannot explain consciousness. There's nothing that predicts consciousness. But rather than saying, well, what's wrong with the worldview, we say, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's something to do with information theory, maybe it's the chemistry, maybe it's this, and people come up with lots of different theories about how the brain creates consciousness, but nothing works. This is the hard question that was referred to, that Maurizio referred to in the video. The easy question in philosophy, the easy question is, what goes on in the brain when we have a certain experience? You know, what goes on in the brain when you fall in love? What goes on in the brain when you do a long division sum? What goes on in the brain? You know, we're just beginning to get an idea of some of these things. And maybe in 50 years' time, maybe we'll understand that and we'll have a complete or nearly complete understanding of the brain and be able to predict our experience from the brain. But why should any of that processing give rise to an experience? That's the hard problem. And really, there are two different questions, you see. One question is, does the brain affect what we experience? And the answer is pretty much yes. The other question is, does the brain create the capacity for experience? And it is assumed that it does, but I think that's where the problem is. Because it assumes that somehow dead, unconscious, inanimate matter that we are composed of, that the brains are composed of, the matter of the neurons, somehow magically creates experience. Something magic happens, and out of that comes subjective experience, out of objective matter. And say people are sort of struggling to get their heads around this. How does it happen? But I think we're all on the wrong track. We accept that other creatures are conscious. I mean, we accept our pets are conscious. Where do we draw the line between what is conscious and unconscious? We might say, well, maybe vertebrates, animals with a spinal cord are conscious, but what about insects? They don't have a spinal cord. Are they conscious? Do they have an experience? If you say, well, no, they don't, they're just biological robots, then you have to say, well, what's the difference between a spinal cord, an animal with a spinal cord and an insect? What's the difference that suddenly creates experience? Or if you say, well, or maybe insects have an experience. I mean, I actually find it difficult to pull the legs off a spider. Because I sense that it's going to feel its equivalent of pain. It's going to have some sort of inner experience, maybe tiny compared to ours. Where do you draw the line? Maybe, well, you say, well, spiders have awareness, but worms don't. What is it about a spider's nervous system that brings awareness that isn't in a worm. Wherever you draw the line, one side of the line you have no experience, the other side of the line, something magic happens and you have experience. Where people are going in this, where the sort of the leading edge of research is going in this, or leading edge of thinking, is to say that actually consciousness is there all along. It isn't something that arises out of matter when the conditions are right. It isn't something that emerges at a certain level of complexity or a certain system. But consciousness, the ability for experience is always there in everything. And more people are beginning to open up to this view. It's what in philosophy is called panpsychism. Pan means all, psyche, mind. So literally, mind is in all. Everything has mind. But this is actually still a very dualistic model, because it's saying there's matter here and there's experience here, and it's like the two go together. But this is actually a dualism, this form of philosophy. It's not a non-dual philosophy. And ultimately, I think where we need to go is the step beyond that, to say that consciousness is not just as fundamental as space, time, matter, and energy. It's not something which coexists with space, time, matter, energy. Consciousness is actually the fundamental, I don't want to say substance, it's the fundamental essence of existence, out of which comes the experience of space, time, energy, and matter. That field of information in which we live in which we are embedded, is an aware field. And this part of the field, this part of that aware field, is sensing other parts of that aware field and creating for itself the experience of matter, energy, space, and time. And in that sense, we are creating the material world. We are creating the experience of the material world. I don't mean we are creating the material world in the way that some people talk about it, or I'm creating that accident, or I'm creating that event in my life. No, we are creating the experience of materiality out of a world which is ultimately just awareness, just a field of being aware. And that is what so many of the great spiritual teachings have been pointing to, that the material world we see is actually not an illusion so much as a delusion. It's a false interpretation of what is there, that the ultimate nature of everything is consciousness. That wonderful quote which ended the video from Nisargadatta, that what you perceive as matter is ultimately just consciousness. Or the Upanishads of ancient India, 2,500 years ago. The Mahavakya, which is like the great truth of the Upanishads, says that I am that. I am consciousness. I am that being aware. Thou art that. Thou art that being aware. All of this is that being aware. And that alone is. Being aware is alone. And I think on that I shall pause, finish. I shall be saying more on Sunday on all of this, but going in more detail, but I think that's enough for now. So thank you.